Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Thank you guys for hosting. Thanks for coming, and if you're watching online, appreciate it. Yeah, so this is going to be a talk about a perspective paper that I've worked on with these co-authors here, Terry Sinowski, Lau Miller, and my former PhD advisor, Max. The title is a Spacetime perspective, as you guys heard, on dynamical computation in neural information processing systems. It's in progress. It's not published yet. It's coming out soon. So if you want to cite something that you see in the talk, reach out to me. I can send you the link or the citation. Or also, if you're interested in this stuff, please do contact me. I didn't put my email on here, but hopefully you can find me. So yeah, without further ado, I'm gonna introduce a really high-level idea of what we mean by conceptual paradigms. So when you look up at the stars, right, you see starlight and you don't think about how far away something is, the fact that this star maybe is emitting light from hundreds of thousands of years ago that's just now reaching your eyes. You don't think about the fact that this star is maybe, or the light from this star is maybe 100,000 years older than the light from that star further away, right? This is a conceptual paradigm that people have that lived in this world for millennia, for thousands of years. So from Aristotle to Rene Descartes up to Isaac Newton, up to just about 400 years ago, people believed that light traveled instantaneously, that there was everything you see is exactly the world as it is. This was until about 400 years ago. There was this Danish scientist, Ole Romer, who was looking at the orbit of Io, one of Jupiter's moons, for an entirely different reason. He wanted to use it for measuring kind of longitude of ships that are traveling, trying to make money, right? Well, it turns out when he was looking at this, he noticed that depending on the time of the year, the amount of time it took for Io to do this orbit and to be eclipsed by Jupiter varied on the order of 10 to 20 minutes, something like this. So actually, he wasn't the first person to notice this. Cassini noticed this before he did, but he was the first person to really dig into it. And what he concluded is kind of like this evidence, there's only one real explanation that makes sense for why this evidence is here, and that's that the speed of light actually has that light has a finite speed, right? It can't travel then. And he was able to actually calculate that by knowing the radius of the Earth's orbit and the amount of time that it took between these eclipses. Anyway, he presented this. Some reporters picked up on it, and from that point on, it kind of spurred a new conceptual paradigm. This idea that light does have a finite speed limit, Einstein's relativity, Maxwell's electromagnetism, and so forth. So why do I talk about this? I'm not trying to compare our work to these people. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But I think it shows that it's easy, based on what recording technologies you have, to get into a given conceptual paradigm. And sometimes if you look for the evidence that's kind of opposed to that, it may provide signs as to how you should be thinking about things differently. And I'm going to say today that I think there's signs of this right now in the neuroscience literature. So I'm going to be talking about the evolving paradigms of neural information processing systems, how they've been so far, the mounting evidence that it's kind of time maybe we need to think differently, our proposed space-time perspective on this, the projected benefits of thinking that way, and then maybe why it's a unifying perspective for neuroscience and AI. So talking about evolving paradigms. So back in the early paradigms, really, you can see when you're looking at the literature, were formed by the recording technologies that were available. So this was Stephen Kuffler measuring the receptive fields of retinal ganglion cells, showing that they have this kind of center surround profile. In 51, Buell and Weasel ended up joining his lab because he was one of the first people to have this technology, this single cell recording technology. And they showed, oh, okay, now we can actually measure selectivity of neurons in V1 to orientations of lines. And this really kind of spurred this field. They won the Nobel Prize, obviously. Now we want to measure the selectivity of every neuron in the brain, right? Maybe neurons are kind of getting more and more complex as you get higher up. They're selective to more and more complex things. It wasn't just the selectivity, however, they wanted to look at the organization of this selectivity. So this was People in Weasel also were measuring kind of this topographic organization of orientation selectivity, and the fact that you have these regions they call pinwheels or hypercolumns, composed of orientation columns, that kind of maintained all positions of an angle around, or all positions of a line around its full orientation, right? And they called this a small machine that takes care of all the pose of a given variable, something like that. And it didn't just stop there, right? We all know people have continued to explore this kind of organization of selectivity into higher visual cortex with regions that are selective to faces and places. And so what we've kind of, one way of framing this conceptual paradigm is in terms of elaborated hierarchical receptive fields as you move through the neural processing system. And this was kind of elaborated again as early as Hubel and Weasel. You combine these LGN receptive fields to make lines, and you combine the lines to make kind of invariant feature detectors. But this didn't just stay in the neuroscience literature. This really influenced a lot of machine learning as well. So this is kind of the proto-CNN, Fukushima's neocognitron architecture. And you can see he really was inspired by these simple cells and complex cells, denoting them US1 and C1, with this idea that you have these receptive fields that tile space, and they're combined, pulled together to induce invariances. Later architectures, there's HMAX, there's LeCun CNN, that share this same kind of conceptual framework. And what I'm going to argue today is that we have new Jupiter's moons, right? And these are potentially challenging that framework of how we think about things. And so what is that? Let's see if I can get these videos to play. Maybe. It's really these observed spatiotemporal dynamics in the brain across all scales. So this is fMRI at the global scale between multiple brain components, right? Like thalamus, cerebellum, cortex, at the super slow scale. This is in primary visual cortex at the fastest possible scales in a very small region. I'm going to go over these in more detail in a little bit, but we really see these dynamics everywhere on their own, evoked by activity, and these go against potentially, or people in the past have thought that maybe these go against this idea of structured selectivity in the brain. So why is that? Why do we think that there is this, not catching up. There we go. Why do we think that there's this conceptual conflict, right? So we're in America, we're going to talk about football. In a football stadium, a lot of times your stadium is divided on two sides. You have like fans on one side cheering for one team, fans on the other side cheering for the other team. So if you kind of have a naive interpretation of this and you're watching the football stadium, you're watching what's happening on the field, you may think, okay, after a while, if I see the fans stand up on the blue side, that means the blue team has scored, right? Or the blue team has done something interesting, right? They're acting in response to the blue team. But then, say for example, you saw this dynamic. Oh, the video is lagging. The traveling, like the wave of activity that happens sometimes in stadiums. I don't know if you've gone to a game, you see people stand up and sit down kind of in this orderly progression across the stadium. How would we interpret that in this framework of like cheering corresponds to scoring? Well, you can't, right? Suddenly it's like red team scored, blue team scored, red team scored, blue team scores. That doesn't make any sense. So you probably just ignore it, right? You do like some global averaging over the stadium, that effect would go away. And then you say, oh, it's just noise. But if we think about it a little bit more carefully, you can see these are really two fundamentally different signals, two different types of dynamics. And yes, maybe this does encode the fact that the team has done something interesting on the field, but this is encoding something different, right? Maybe there's nothing going on the field and they're trying to communicate a message to each other, or there's something else going on, right? Maybe there's something on the billboard. So that's why I think a lot of times in early work, people have thought of these two types of dynamics as contradictory. in our perspective, we're saying, okay, maybe they're more complementary, and I'll try to get to that if I don't take too long here. So let's go through more history. The mounting evidence for the fact that these waves actually exist. This is 1934, way back in the day, right? Recordings, you can see this is the recording sites of 3 different electrodes. And this is a pulse of activity of a like electrical activity you can measure at one electrode, and so sequentially later in time it hits these other electrodes, right? This is a measurement of a traveling wave back in 1934. In 1950, so this was Adrian and Matthews, Mickle and Aids measured this in 53 as well, and they more precisely characterized the actual speed of these waves. And I'll just put these quotes up here because I think sometimes the words are equally powerful. An identical pattern of activity may appear at points 10 millimeters or more apart. There is no doubt that waveforms appear to spread across the cortical surface. So I'm going to show you some more evidence, and hopefully you agree that there is no doubt, because I don't want to have to give this talk anymore. So here is an example from hippocampus multi-electrode array. This paper, fantastic, showed that the theta oscillations that we measure in hippocampus are actually traveling waves of activity that propagate across the surface of the hippocampus. And subsequent work showed it's not just theta oscillations, alpha oscillations, gamma oscillations. A lot of these things can actually be measured to be traveling waves and not just these standing waves we were talking about. In primates, awake behaving primates, you can measure these waves to be traveling. I believe this is over area MT with another multi-electrode array, and you can measure the phase of the wave to have a direct impact on behavior on a task. In this case, they're trying to detect low contrast stimuli. I wanted to show this just because it's a cool video. We hope. This is in humans while they're performing some cognitive tasks. You're looking at really slow fluctuations of fMRI bold signals, and they measure the vorticity of these the phase field of these oscillations, and you can see that there's these little spirals that move around and go in different directions and collide with each other, and they're able to correlate the positions of these spirals with the tasks that people are solving and the performance on the task. And okay, so that was like the neural data, but it's not just in experimental data, right? So in theory, you may have heard of like Wilson and Cohen neural field models. This is 1973. They have kind of these idealized models of the cortical sheet and excitatory inhibitory neurons. They model it as a one-dimensional line. And basically, with these somewhat idealized equations, you show if you put a pulse of activity right in the center here, over time, that pulse will spread and turn into 2 traveling waves that travel outwards. So theoretically, these waves are analytic solutions to the neural field equations. More recently, this paper got a ton of attention. You can use wave equations and what you derive from wave equations to more accurately model fMRI data. Some argument to that, but that's what they claim, as well as EEG data, and that's been studied for a long time. Okay, so I hope you agree. It's like we've seen waves, and they're in our theory, and everyone has to come up with their own hypothesized functional roles. And so this is just going to be a list of papers where people talk about like they measured waves and they correlated them with some sort of role of activity. People have claimed they serve to transfer information, they modulate visual processing, they use to sequence cortical regions, to execute complex motor movements, structure cortical space, encode motion, consolidate long-term memories, storage of short-term memory, storage of working memory. So we've measured waves. We know that there are solutions to these somewhat idealized neural field equations, and we've correlated them with a ton of behavior. I think it's fair to say, like, okay, maybe we should start considering these wave dynamics in our way of thinking about how neural information processing systems process information. So what is our proposed framework really about? And what is the core of it? What are we saying you should be caring about rather than just saying look for waves? One of the core ideas is this idea that traveling waves are space-time inseparable functions. And it's not just traveling waves, it's a broader class of functions. And this is something that is really emphasized in this paper by Alexander Donders' dead paper, which is fantastic. Basic idea is a function that is spacetime separable, such as a standing wave, can be decomposed into a function of only space and only time separately, whereas an inseparable function cannot, right? So this is f of x minus vt, a function that mixes space and time, cannot be separated. And in this paper, he really goes to show that a lot of the techniques that neuroscientists use to analyze data a lot of the time is just implicitly assuming inseparability. So this is trial averaging, assuming separability, trial averaging, baseline subtraction, and that induces not just noise, but potentially incorrect conclusions about what's happening. So to give an example of that, this is the same video from, come on, Andy, from before of a monkey being shown a small Gaussian blob on a screen and looking in V1, and basically, well, the video stopped here, but it's playing on my screen. What you see is that in the trial averaged version, the bump basically just goes straight up and straight down, right? Whereas if you look at the single trial level, you can really see that there's a wave of activity that moves. And so the reason for this, you can think of a lot of different reasons, but imagine waves are going in different directions over time, or there's a bunch of background activity over time, waves traveling in different directions. You're not going to be able to capture that in the trial average version. This is average over something like 50 trials versus a single trial. This is just one example. I'm not saying this is the core of everything that it means to consider spatiotemporal dynamics and neural activity, but this is one kind of representative phenomena that you're going to miss if you don't take that stuff into consideration. Okay, so what are the projected benefits of, and let me say also, there's one other kind of key component that we point to in the paper, which is time delays in these systems. If you have transmission time delays, this is going to induce a lot of this structure that we see. And so that's another kind of core component of thinking about spatiotemporal dynamics. So what are the projected benefits of thinking about neural systems this way? What can it yield for neuroscience, for computation in general, right? For AI and machine learning. And what I'm going to argue here, and this was kind of the argument of my PhD thesis as well, which I'm just now being able to communicate well, I think. It's the idea that spatiotemporal dynamics are a natural inductive bias towards representing abstract symmetries of the world in a kind of an efficient and flexible way. So I don't think I have to kind of preach to the choir on this topic here. I have one slide. Why do we care about symmetries? Well, there's a lot of people who say that they're perhaps the most natural decomposition of the world. And so I would really recommend this first paper here, which argues that, I think, in the most clear way possible. But this picture is from the Higgins et al. Work, where they provide a formalized definition of disentanglement through these symmetries. And you can think about it like the position of an object, its colors, its 3D orientation. These are the types of things, and it helps you to describe the world in a really kind of consistent manner. So how do we do this today in artificial neural networks? Well, if we know the representation theory and our transformations conform to this mathematical group structure, we can build equivariant neural networks, right? So this is a convolutional neural network. I know that I've built it such that if I translate my input, I have a corresponding translation operation that's happening in my latent space because I know the representation of the translation group. Similarly, for rotation and translation combined, if I rotate my input, I know how to build my neural network with a set of rotated filters such that my output has some predictable transformation in the latent space, which is a shift or a rotation and a shift of the feature maps here. But what happens if we don't know, like, the representation theory, or maybe we don't even know the transformations and we want to learn them from data, right? When you're born, I assume you don't know all of the possible transformations of the world that you're going to experience and things that you want to be able to represent, right? I don't know every possible piece of clothing that you're going to wear. I still want to be able to identify it's you. That was an example from Carrie as well. So one idea is build capsules. And what is a capsule? Kind of a generalized view of this. The idea is that you have a subspace, your features are decomposed into these subspaces, which if you look at the Higgins paper, you can find a more formal definition of this in terms of groups and group decompositions. But within a capsule, you're storing the kind of the instantiation of that object, the fact that it exists, as well as its all potential symmetry transformations of that object that you're interested in. So it's rotation, shape, pose, and whatever. The core part is that if that thing changes, if the nose changes, the magnitude of this capsule doesn't change. So I can just measure the magnitude to say, okay, yeah, Christian has a nose. But I can figure out also, I'm not just invariant to the fact that he has a nose, I can figure out what type of nose he has, right? By looking at where in that capsule this exists. It's a great nose. And this isn't just in these capsule networks, Jeff Hinton, right? This is also in equivariant networks. The same thing happens. If I rotate my input, the total magnitude of this rotation capsule stays the same, right? And now I can tell where the pose of the feature is by looking at how it's shifted in this space. Okay, so we want to build capsules. In theory, that's the idea. That's kind of our intuition. How can we learn these capsules from data? And how can we build a bias towards learning these capsules? And the main idea is that we want to impose some sort of locality and slowness on our latent representations that matches that we see in the real world. So the tagline I've written is the world transforms slowly and spatiotemporal dynamics flow locally. I liked it because it rhymed. That was about it. So the world transforms slowly, right? Leaves maybe will slowly rotate and fall. If I'm standing in this world or in this room, I know that everyone here is still here, despite the fact that I've turned my head and my sensory perception has changed dramatically, right? I know that the world outside, the true state of the world is roughly invariant over short time scales, but my internal sensations are changing dramatically. So that's a symmetry of the world that I should be preserving, despite the fact that I have transformations going on. So spatiotemporal dynamics will cause your activity to flow locally around a capsule, for example, as a rotation equivariant neural network, in correspondence with the world transforming slowly in my visual senses. And so this isn't just for rotation equivariance. We say that this type of an idea can apply to arbitrary symmetry transformations. If for example, you're looking at this horse getting ready to jump. Maybe you have a space, a subspace of your neural activity where the activity flows across this kind of like horse pose capsule to represent the horse's pose. And you can think maybe this has some relations to like neural manifolds and so forth. And I'll just say, I don't know how much time I have, but you can find these types of equivariant capsules in the brain at the simplest level, and we're by far not the first people to notice this. This is demonstrating the filters of one of these rotation equivariant neural networks. You can see it's the same kind of filter at all different orientations. If you look in V1, like I said, they have these hypercolumns, and we're proposing this as somewhat of the simplest possible instantiation of this idea. And it would make sense that you would find the simplest possible one in the earliest visual cortex. So I'll go over very briefly some of our work that I think illustrates that this is kind of a way to understand both neuroscience and AI. And there are some other papers as well that I was not on that I think are worthwhile reading, just so you don't think it's all about me. But the first set of topics will be about how spatiotemporal dynamics encode visual symmetries, like I've been talking about so far. And so this is this idea of, I had a slide that I took out, I'll put it back in. Spatiotemporal dynamics learn, or having some sort of locality in your representation can learn structure of your data. This is from this topographic VAE paper. We imposed a prior on our latent space such that activity occurs in these little local bumps in our latent space, and we've organized them into a sheet. And if I show this model a set of squares that are just different X and Y positions, we see that the selectivity of the neurons in my model organize themselves according to the correlation statistics of the data, and it kind of recovers the topology of the transformations on this space. So in a sense, you can think of it like learning the structure of the symmetry group there. And it's not just like this locality idea. Here we go. Okay. There's like this idea of shifting locality. If you have that bump move over time, which is what we ended up doing, then and you force the network to encode observed transformations at the same time, you'll see that the shifting locality encodes these symmetry transformations in the data, such as rotation and so forth. We don't want it to be like this kind of manually imposed shift. We want the model to, we want to have a more general natural inductive bias, right? What is the inductive bias our brain has that causes it to organize its whatever selectivity or latent space according to transformations? One could be that of a bias towards waves. One way to build a model with wave dynamics is as a network of coupled oscillators. That's what we did in this paper. A network of locally coupled oscillators can approximate a wave field. So we build an RNN that is constructed as a network of locally coupled oscillators. We train it to do forward prediction on some transformation task, and we see that we get waves of activity propagating in the latent space in accordance with that task. And you see for a variety of different samples, the waves all propagate in the same direction, but they have a different form, which I'll get back to. So why is that relevant to this idea of transformations and learning transformations? These waves are really encoding the transformation itself, and we proved that by encoding an input, applying artificially waves to the latent space, and then decoding, and we can see that it reconstructs the transformation the model has learned. So this is like a causal demonstration that waves are really encoding the transformation of the input over time.
So you just have a bunch of coupled oscillators, it's kind of like a liquid state machine kind of thing, and then you're linearly decoding from it, and you're learning the linear decoder?
Yes, but we're also learning the connectivity between the oscillators, the coupling parameters. You can learn damping coefficients. Yeah, I can show you the equations at the end. So one of the potentially crazy things about this that we found is that these waves seem to induce a form of topographic organization. This isn't something I expected. It's just something we thought, okay, maybe we should look at. So this is our latent state. Each pixel is a little neuron, and this is kind of what's happening as we're showing it rotating digits. If we go and measure the orientation selectivity of each neuron, so which one of these lines is the most selective to, we get this locally kind of like smooth organization of activity, maybe very similar to what you see in V1. So this is part of our argument that, in fact, these ideas may be more complementary than contradictory, as people may have assumed before. So I'm going to finally say, it's not just these visual symmetries like rotation or translation. You can encode more abstract temporal symmetries as well with these types of dynamics. So this is what we call a space-time neural representation. This is an illustration of a field in space. This field has given values in space, and if you perform a specific transformation to it, a Galilean transformation, which is inherently a traveling wave, the values of this field are invariant to that transformation, or the inverse of this transformation. You can imagine doing an inverse here. And so what this says is that the information that's encoded actually stays the same over time. It's just being shifted by some factor, right? So this is a invariance that's induced by this time symmetry, similar to how we have kind of like object invariance induced by maybe these other symmetries in our model. And in fact, we see this exactly in our model, right? So this wave maintains the same form, despite the fact that it's propagating over, and it's different from this form, which is encoding at 8. This is encoding at 3. It's really in the relative phases of these neurons that the information is encoded, and it's just the position, the overall shift that encodes the orientation of the thing. So this is what we call a space-time representation in our model. We built a model that has these types of representations more useful for memory. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into the details. Ask me later. But basically what we show is that it works significantly better for memorizing inputs over long periods of time. So you show it a sequence, require it to wait a long time and reproduce it. It learns exponentially faster and solves much longer tasks than these regular RNNs do. Finally, how is it unifying? How is this helpful to the machine learning community at all? Well, these types of dynamics are present in existing large-scale models. People just don't talk about them in terms of waves. So it was started off by this Hungry Hippos model, which is now what all of these large-scale SSMs are built upon. They use this block structure. This shift SSM is exactly the shift operator that we have in our wave RNN model that I skipped over really quickly. Effectively, our recurrent dynamics in that model, our recurrent matrix, is this shift operator. All the later models use that exact same component called conv here. And if you want to know exactly how they derive this, I can answer that later. It's not just the state space model people. This is also present in XLSTM, and this is also present in DeepMind's Griffin model. And they all seem to have inherited it from this H3 block. And you can think of this shift as a neural network latent space that is shifting at each time step, kind of like a wave propagating forwards, right? We'll skip that. So in the end, what are the predictions of this framework? Wave content should be decodable at any location. So the information should be invariant to the exact neurons that are encoding it. Wave memory and stimuli should be encoded differently. So whether something is propagating in memory versus getting an external stimulus, there's already some evidence for this. And spatiotemporal dynamics should be able to be precisely correlated with abstract symmetries and conserved quantities. Conclusions, we must consider space and time jointly. This is inseparability, time delays, single trial analysis. And really, spatiotemporal dynamics may be a mechanism by which the brain learns flexible, structured representations of the world, enabling this efficiency and generalization that we're lacking. And then finally, just because I have to, some people may laugh at this, but I think analogous to the introduction of quantum mechanics at the turn of the 20th century, we suggest using wave mechanics to understand neural information processing systems. And I think that this could yield a lot of interesting new insights. So thank you for having me. Thanks to these people, these wonderful people, and this building for paying me.